Hi, it's Rob from the Brush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to paint the Lord of Virulence. So here he is, ready to go, and the first colour we're going to use is Vallejo Modeler Rust. We're going to be using this on all of the decorations and the armour trim and that kind of thing. So you've got that kind of ridge going up his shoulder there, we're going to be using it on that, on the little icons on the side of his plague spewer, also the tanks that are on his back and on the plague spewer. Two of the exhausts on his side as well, we're going to be doing them in the same colour. Once you've finished this layer, we can move on to the next one. So next up, we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Leadbelcher. It's going to be used for doing some parts of the body of the plague spewer. We're also going to be using this to do some of the exhausts and the bits between the armour plates on his armour. And a few of the other small metallic details, like the little bits of tubing that are poking out from the fleshy tubes that hang down from that kind of flesh skirt on his back. I didn't realise quite how much detail was on this until I started painting it, so it's been quite a long process getting it finished, but I am quite happy now that he's done. It's a great miniature. Now I'm going to use Citadel Ballor Brown. I'm going to use this to paint the whole of the skirt and the tubes which are on the back there. I'm also going to use this to paint one of the tubes on his arm, and some of the other bits and pieces, like this little tube coming from the tank on the plague spewer, leading to the side of the plague spewer. Next up, it's Citadel Cadian Flesh Tone. I'm going to use this to do one of the tubes on his arm here. We're also going to use this to do a section on the plague spewer as well. It's actually meant to be dented metal, but I thought it'd look quite good as a little manky bit of flesh. So we're going to do it in this colour. Now it's going to be Vallejo Russian Uniform World War II, which is one of the Flames of War colour. We could also use some sort of olive drab as well. That'd do a very similar kind of colour for this. Not too sure if anyone wants to see one of the bloat drones being painted up, or one of the plague drones, like the plague bearers kind of horrible flying flies, but if so, give us a shout and get one of them done. Next up, Citadel Kislev Flesh. I'm going to use this just to do the final tube on his arm there. The very top one, it's not too much of it at all really, so a very quick layer this one. Like so. Now we're going to be using a little bit of Citadel Rakarth Flesh, and this is just for the little horn that's poking out the top of his head there. Seems unusual to have so little Rakarth Flesh used, but there is only this little tiny horn on the front there. Like so. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Avalanche Sunset, and this is just going to be to paint one of the little tubes that's coming down from the side of his face. I think it's probably the first yellow and black tube that's ever been painted onto one of my Death Guard. So it's something a little bit different here, but just kind of looking at the box art a little bit to see how it was painted, so stuck with that little stripy tube. Now I'm going to use some Vallejo Black, and this is going to be to do the body of his plague spewer. Feels like I've been painting quite a few of these recently, with painting the can on the back of one of the plague marines with the plague spewer, and then painting up more slug. Actually painting up a Blight Lord Terminator who's got one at the moment as well, so just seems to be an abundance of plague spewers. Now it's going to be Citadel Moot Green. I'm going to use this to do all of the slime and his eye lenses too. Now there is a lot of drips and runs on this model. You have it coming out of each of the tubes hanging from that kind of fleshy skirt. You also have all over that power glove on his left hand there, you have lots of drips and runs on that, and coming from the tubes on the back too. So there is plenty of opportunity to do the green drips and stuff like that. I'll link the video of how I do these. That does a start to finish tutorial of how to do the drips and get them looking like they are liquid. Now I've gone on to Citadel Seraphim Sepia Shade, and this is going to be to do all of the white armour and also that Rakarth flesh horn that's growing out of his head too. Now you want to get quite a good coat of this on, so that you've got darker areas in the recesses and the rest of it is just stained, so it's a bit of an off-white colour. I then go over this with a slightly off-white colour too, which you'll see, but as long as you get the shade in the recesses, that'll be fine. Next up, Citadel Nuln Oil. I'm going to use this on all of the Leadbelcher. So any of those silvery metallic parts that you've got, lash a bit of Nuln Oil on, just to get the shade into the recesses and dull up that metal so it's not shiny anymore. Or not as shiny, I should say. You find it annoying that there's a split down the centre of the barrels there. It seems to be the case with all the plague spewers. But it does look a bit untidy, I think. So next up we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Agrax Earthshade shade. I'm going to use this to paint all of the Vallejo model rust. Get a nice dose of that on there, so you've got the shade in the recesses, and like with the Nuln Oil it does dull down that shine, so it's not as shiny. It looks a bit weathered and grimy. That's the effect that we're after for it. Once you've finished that, we can move on to the next layer. Now it's going to be Citadel Athonian Camoshade. I'm going to use this to paint up the Cadian flesh tone, and also we're going to use it to do the almost wing bits of that skirt too. You don't want to be doing the ridges of the skirt if you're following this the way I do it. The kind of ridges come down, I'm going to be painting them with a different shade, and it's just the actual flaps of skin that are between those ridges that is going to be washed with Athonian Camo shade. Start doing one of those bits there, but then change my mind part way through. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Biel-tan green. This is going to be to shade all of those drips and the runs of Moot green that we put on earlier. So though there isn't too many recesses on these little bits that are dripping at the bottom there is some indents and stuff like that. So once you put this Biel-tan green onto those little drips and runs, then I will shade those areas, and it makes it a little bit easier when you come to highlight it and make it look like drips. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Snakebite Leather Contrast. We're just going to use this to do the string, which seems to be tied around this tube. There's a bit of a cheap way of doing this. Rather than painting it with a few layers, I'm just going to use Snakebite Leather, get that done, and we can concentrate on everything else. Time for a little bit of Citadel Carroburg Crimson. I'm using an Army Painter Wargamer character brush here, just to use the Carroburg Crimson on all of these little recesses of the fly in his bloated stomach. With that done, I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Fuegan Orange just to do the yellow tube which is coming from his snout to behind his head. Like so. Now it's going to be Citadel Drakenhof Nightshade. We're going to use this to do the tubes on his back, which go between the flaps of skin on his skirt. All this will do is when we come to paint it up and give it layers and highlight it, we'll be doing it all at the same time. Because of that shade, it'll give that slightly different colour and make those stand out against the rest of the skirt. Next up, we're going to start using some Vallejo White and some Citadel Ushabti bone mixed in there, so you've got a slightly off-white colour. We're going to start reapplying this to all of the armour. Now, it's quite a long layer this, because it's quite a few armour plates. Some of them are a bit tricky to get to, sort of underneath those exhausts on his shoulders there, and around anywhere with those exhausts in fact. Also around his head, you've got his neck as well, has got some ridges and details underneath that snout that pokes out, so those wires and tubes really make that a pain in the bum to paint up. The armour recoloured, looking a little bit bright there. We're now going to use some Vallejo Russian Uniform World War II, or the olive drab, whichever you've used, to start reapplying colour to the green. Now you want to think about where the light's hitting this, so that you're leaving some of that shade on the underside and areas that aren't going to be catching that light. Once you've reapplied all the Russian uniform, we're going to add a little bit of Vallejo White to it. And then we're going to start highlighting that green. So you're going to be leaving some of the Russian uniform showing through, so you're going to have areas that are shaded, some with the Russian uniform and then some with this highlight. I'll just give that a look as though it's catching the light, without too much effort. On areas like this, you want to make sure that you're getting the top side of any ridges and things like that, just so that they are standing out. It makes it look like the light's catching them. Now I'm going to add a little bit more white to the previous mix. I'm just going to do one more highlight on these greens, and this is mainly kind of like an edge highlight. I'm not going to use too much of it anywhere else. There's going to be a few little bits at the very peak of the kneecaps and also the peak of the shoulders. But mainly we're going to be using this to highlight some edges and some little details on the greens, just to make sure that they stand out. Now we're going to go for Citadel Cadian Flesh Tone. We're going to start reapplying some colour to his stomach and also the tube that we painted with the same colour. We're also going to shuffle them slightly further up onto the screen so that we can see what we're painting properly. Like so. Now to mank up that skin, we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Deepkin Flesh to lighten the Cadian Flesh Tone. Now we're going to start doing highlights. I'll do slightly more highlights on this stomach here, mainly because I want it to look as though it's a bit dead and a bit pale. It's hanging out there quite horrible. It's also cut to ribbons with that image of the fly across it, so I wanted to make it look a little bit dead and dying, almost like the original Dawn of the Dead zombies, with their really pasty faces. Next up, we're adding some more Citadel Deepkin Flesh to the previous mix, and we're going to start highlighting that stomach once more. As I say, I wanted to make this look a little bit dead, so it's got that kind of blood drained look to it. And we're just going to add a few little trickles of wet blood at the end, but mainly have it looking as though it's just a bit off, not too pleasant. Once more, we're adding some Citadel Deepkin Flesh to the previous mix. we're just going to do another highlight on that skin. You can see it looking quite pale and pasty now, which is the kind of look I'm going for. So now we're going to start working on the Citadel Valor Brown once more. We're going to start using this on those tubes. So we're going to be reapplying the Valor Brown to get them all back to a nice colour, and as we start going through the different layers of this and the different colours that we're using for it, you'll start to notice that the tubes are starting to look like different colours altogether. Same as with the Cadian flesh tone, we're now going to add some Citadel Deepkin flesh. We're going to start working on the tubes and the skin areas. So with this, you do want to make sure that you're leaving some of the shading and some of the previous layer so that you get some nice highlights, and it is worth taking your time when you're doing this, just because there's so many ridges and little details and things like that on this that you can get it looking really nice by just making sure you try and keep them as obvious as possible. So again, we're going to add a little bit more Deepkin flesh to the previous mix. We're going to start highlighting that once more. I'm using a small layer brush from Citadel here to paint this, but you may find as you go on you might want to go to an even thinner brush, a Wargamer character brush, or whatever your thin brushes are, just to make sure that you can pick up those details, because you've got little ridges around a lot of those wiry parts that are showing through. You've got little ridges above and below them in some parts, and also like just little flaps of skin and ridges within those almost like wing parts on the back. Once more, add some more Deepkin flesh to it. I'm going to start highlighting that again. You can see the ridges and stuff like that are starting to stand out a lot here, and there's this kind of final layer time that really makes those stand out and brings them to life. The colours kind of going for was the Mynocks from Star Wars that are fluttering around the Falcon when it's parked up on the asteroid in Empire Strikes Back. That's what I was going for with that skirt. So now we're returning to Citadel Kislev flesh. Going to start repainting this tube. Like so. And then again adding some Deepkin flesh to that Kislev flesh so we can start to highlight that too. Can add a little bit more Deepkin flesh to the previous mix now and just add another highlight to that. The big tube that we painted where it's got those pieces of string around it. Not sure why, it reminds me of those tinned hot dog sausages you get. I think it's because of the way the end's creased up on it. A little bit more Deepkin flesh to the previous mix. We're going to do another highlight to that. Okay, next up, we're going to go back to Citadel Moot Green. We're going to start working on all those drips and runs. So as we always do, we're going to paint down one side and do kind of like an inverted J or an actual J shape down some of those drips. So you have a long lighter bit down one side, then it curls around underneath. So you want to be trying to do this on as many drips as you possibly can. That long drip coming from his hand there has a J on one side and an inverted or reverse J on the other side. They both join up underneath. We want to try and get that kind of effect going on each of the drips. So we're going to add a little bit of white to the Moot Green, and we're going to start doing the next highlight. I'll link up exactly how to do drips here, so that you can follow that guide of how to do them. I think you'll find it really useful. It breaks it down into each layer and what you're trying to do with each layer and how it looks, where to do the highlights and where to do the shades and things like that. But if you do follow that guide and do the drips, then you will end up with some great looking liquid on there. I can add a little bit more white to the previous mix. Just keep highlighting those. Also doing those little ridges on his arm and his shoulder there. And also doing the eye lenses. So with each layer and each highlight you want to be doing the eye lenses too. This is for all of the Moot green, including that section on the plague spewer. I'm doing 4 areas of highlights on that. So where you've got that kind of brass fitting just in front of the green. I think a little bit more white to the previous mix now. We've got that kind of brass fitting in front of the green. Where the points of that go into the green, between those I'm doing a highlight, as you can probably see there. So it has 3 bands of light that are wider on the outside edges and thinner in the middle. It's basically the same effect as the thermic plasma vent, so I'll link up that as well. Same kind of thing that I do on plasma guns too. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Biel-tan green, and where we've got those drips we're just going to use this to shade the darker areas so that they're even darker, because that's where we're going to be putting the highlights. Again, as I say, I'll link up that drips video here too. It is worth having a watch of that. I think you will find it quite useful. You can see the drips coming to life now. Now we're just going to use some Vallejo White. We're just going to start doing the highlights now. So we're going to be doing some little lines of light and spots of light in those darker areas. And also where you've done the highlights, you want to have a really thin white line coming down and going underneath. So like the thinnest of highlights where you've been doing all the other highlights. And then in the darker areas you want to be putting little spots of light or lines of light, just to make them look like the light is reflecting from them. You see this, the miniatures turned around as we start to paint other areas shortly. Next up is Citadel Avalanche Sunset. I'm going to start reapplying colour to this pipe which is coming from his back round to his snout. Just going to do 1 highlight of colour with Citadel Uriel Yellow on this, just to brighten that up a little. So again, it's another very quick layer. And then we're going to use some Vallejo Black just to paint some stripes onto that tube. If you'd like a video of how to paint those stripes on, just sing out in the comments below. It shouldn't be too hard to do that. Now it can be a pain to do. The ones that I do aren't perfect, but it's a reasonably simple method that I use to do these stripes. Like so. Now we're going to use some Vallejo German Grey and we're going to highlight these black areas. So you've got this kind of little coat of arms kind of thing on his front there. And also you've got the black part on his plague spewer. So you want to think about where the light's catching it and where it's going to be highlighted. Like so. Now I'm going to highlight that with some Citadel Mechanica Standard Grey. It's going to be the final highlight for the black. So you want to make sure you're picking out some of those edges that be catching the light. Apologies, slightly off screen there. We want to be picking out all these details and sort of the front edges of that, the top edges of this bracket at the back too. Then you want to do the same on the kind of coat of arms on the front there too. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Dorn yellow. This is going to be to pick out all of the boils and the spots, which is quite a few on his stomach, which you can't really see me painting there because it's slightly off. But you've also got quite a few on the tubes on his arm and a few on the tubes for the skirt at the back too. So you want to make sure you pick all of those out with Dorn yellow, just to give them that kind of pale yellow pustule kind of look. With that done, it's time to make them look painful. We're going to use a little bit of Vallejo red wash. You just want to be putting this around the areas where he's got that fly carved into his stomach to make that look a bit inflamed and painful. Because you've got those highlights under there, it does make it look so it's still very, very light and very, very pale, but it's got that pink discoloration to it. We're also then going to use the red wash to go around all of the boils and pustules to make them look a lot more sore and tender. Going to use this on the skirt part at the back too, where it's got some sort of like little pock marks and things. We're going to use it there as well. Now to do the horn, we're going to start with Citadel Rakarth flesh and just paint that on there, leaving some of the Seraphim Sepia at its base. I'm going to move on to Citadel Ushabti bone. Just use a little bit of this to highlight the Rakarth flesh, so leaving some of the Rakarth flesh showing and doing the Ushabti bone, so like the top third maybe. And then finally on the horn we're going to add a little bit of Vallejo White to the Ushabti bone, and we're just going to do a quick highlight on maybe the top eighth of that horn, like so. I'm going to use Citadel Leadbelcher. I'm going to use this just to paint the horns on the top of his head there, which I'd missed earlier on. Say horns, little studs. There's also some on the underside of his power fist too. Also this little piece of chainmail that I missed. Just going to quickly paint those with Leadbelcher. Then we can shade them as we go on shortly. Another one of the longest sections now. We're using Citadel Seraphim Sepia. I'm going to start painting on those rusty coloured runs on the armour. I'm going to think about them standing up straight and where they would run from, so you've got all those little ridges and creases and the dents and pock marks in the armour. Once you've got all of those done, which does take quite some time, we're going to move on to Citadel Agrax Earthshade, and we're going to add some runs with the Agrax Earthshade too. I'm using Army Painter Wargamer character brush here because it's got a really, really thin tip to the brush, so you can get some nice thin runs going on there. Sometimes you do get the odd one when you put a little bit too much on. That doesn't matter too much, as long as you've got a couple of different shades on there, some thin, some thick. I think it all adds to the look of the manky armour. Now we are starting on the weathering. So we're going to use Citadel Agrax Earthshade, and this is going to be to paint onto some of the Leadbelcher areas. So some of the little bits in the fleshy tubes that are showing through, just to discolour them. You're also going to use it to discolour a lot of the exhausts on the top here. It's going to be the first kind of base for the rust effect, which we'll be adding to these little chimneys and exhausts. So I'll link up the video to the rust here on how to do really good rust. There's a full guide for that. I'm going to use a little bit of Nihilak oxide. I'm going to add some verdigris to all of the Vallejo Modeler rust areas. Doing this while we wait for the Agrax Earthshade to dry so we don't start mixing up shades and leaving ourselves with ridges of colour where it goes wrong. Once you've added some verdigris to all the bronzy coloured parts, we can then move on to adding Citadel Seraphim Sepia to some of the areas that you've just added the Agrax Earthshade to. This gives those areas a nice kind of rusty look to them. It's like discoloured and yellowy orange. Knock the camera a little bit there to make you seasick while you're watching. Once you've finished applying the Seraphim Sepia, we can move on to the next colour. So now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Carroburg Crimson. It's just a little quick one on this fly. We're going to do a few little thin runs of blood from the edges. Also going to do it from some of these little kind of notches and pock marks in the skirt. Now we're going to use some Citadel Typhus Corrosion, and this is going to be to add some texture for the rust effects on the Leadbelcher areas. So you want to think about where the water and the moisture collect on it. So you've got sort of around the top edges of ridges and things on the metal. On the underside of them where the water would be dripping a lot. And then the top of the exhaust as well, you want those to be quite rusted. Once you've got that applied, we can move on to the next colour. The next colour is going to be Citadel Riser Rust, the dry paint. You're just going to get some of that on your brush, gently rub off the worst of it on a bit of paper, and then you're going to start adding the rust effect to the areas that you just painted the Typhus Corrosion, and also some of the areas where you just want to add a little bit of orange discoloration. As I say, I'll link up the rust tutorial here. It shows you start to finish with no sections missed out. It shows you how to do specific areas and things like that, so it's worth having a watch that if you want to get some nice looking rust on the go. And finally, I've given it a spray of Halford's matte lacquer, which is a nice varnish for it, and now that that's done, I'm going to use some Citadel Blood for the Blood God just to add a little bit of glossy blood to the miniature to make that look a little tiny bit disgusting, as though it's quite fresh but also quite rotten and horrible as well, with the colour of the stomach and the way the blood's coming out of it there. Like so. And that is the finished Lord of Virulence. That's a really, really nice miniature. That's got tons of ace details, and that skirt thing at the back is hideous. Really, really pleased with how he turned out. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media, linked below. Thanks very much. If you like the channel, enjoy the content, and you'd like to support us, our Ko-fi and Patreon pages are linked below in the description. Thanks very much.